that's who they were using. They were using those kids as part of their battle plan, and those kids, all they had to wear was just like a loincloth, no shoes, no shirt.
They used children, the veteran said quietly. Little boys no taller than my chest carrying rifles in the dark. His words hang heavy, not as an abstract fact of war, but as a memory that still grips him more than 50 years later. This is the story of a 19-year-old helicopter crew chief in Vietnam, a young man thrust into a war fought in rice paddies, rivers, and endless skies. His account is not about politics or strategy. It is about survival, friendship, loss, and the scars carried home. Through his eyes, we step into the Mekong Delta, where each day began with uncertainty and ended with silence that never truly felt safe. This is his testimony, preserved for memory and for history. He was 19 when he arrived in Vietnam, barely older than the boys still finishing high school back home. Assigned to a platoon known as the Red Knights, he became both crew chief and door gunner on a UH-1 Huey Slick. The Huey, short for Iroquois, was the workhorse of the war. The Slick version was a troop carrier, built to move soldiers, supplies, and sometimes hope into places unreachable by road. His position was unique, responsible for the maintenance of the aircraft, but also for defending it in the air, with an M60 machine gun mounted at the door. Another gunner sat opposite him, mirroring his task. Together, they formed the helicopter's shield, protecting its flanks while pilots guided them into the dangerous skies. He recalls the faces of the crew, 4 men bound together by routine and risk, a pilot, a co-pilot, and 2 young gunners who never knew if the day's mission would be their last. We were ready for battle basically every day, he remembered. They flew patrols from dawn until after dusk, cutting across the flat, waterlogged terrain of the Mekong Delta. This was IV Corps, the southernmost tactical zone of Vietnam, a place defined by rice paddies, canals, and marshes stretching endlessly toward the horizon. To the west lay Cambodia, where the war spilled across invisible lines. To the north, Saigon pulsed with chaos and strategy. But down in the Delta, combat was a daily rhythm, helicopters circling rivers searching for movement, ready to unleash firepower at a moment's notice. Each mission was a gamble. Sometimes they caught enemy fighters out in the open. Other times, they faced silence that felt more threatening than gunfire. At night, the locals turned into the enemy, he said. You never really knew who you were looking at. That confusion would shape much of his memory. Friend and foe blurred, trust dissolved into suspicion, and the young man who arrived in Vietnam soon found himself carrying the weight of decisions no teenager should have to make. When he landed in Vietnam in the summer of 1967, the war was already shifting into one of its most intense phases. The United States had over 400,000 troops in country, and helicopter warfare had become the defining symbol of American presence. The UH-1 Huey was everywhere, used for troop transport, medical evacuation, resupply, and direct combat. At that time, more than 7,000 Hueys were deployed, and by the end of the conflict, over 5,600 would be lost. For young men like him, the helicopter was both a lifeline and a target. The Mekong Delta, where he served, was unlike the dense jungles of central Vietnam. It was a world of rivers, rice paddies, and marshland, flat and exposed, where the enemy could vanish into water or tall grass within seconds. Villages often appeared peaceful by day, only to transform after nightfall. The Viet Cong, the communist guerrillas in the south, blended seamlessly with the civilian population. Their strength came not only from local recruits, many coerced through threats to their families, but also from the North Vietnamese army, which provided guidance, weapons, and discipline. He recalled how disturbing it was to see children pressed into service. They were 11, 12 years old, he said. They wore nothing but a cloth around their waist, carrying satchels with weapons inside. They looked like kids because they were kids. This was part of a deliberate strategy. For American troops, it was a nightmare. Any figure in the distance could be a farmer, a child, or an enemy fighter. By late 1967, U.S. commanders were measuring progress through what was called the body count doctrine, the number of enemy killed in action. Official reports showed victories in numbers, but on the ground, soldiers felt the moral confusion of fighting an enemy that refused to wear uniforms or mark clear lines of battle. Helicopter crews were often ordered to engage anything suspicious on the rivers at night. Our job was to destroy anything that looked hostile, he explained. That meant boats, canoes, and sometimes figures barely visible in the glow of searchlights. The pressure of this environment built steadily, but the true storm was yet to come. Within months, the Tet Offensive would erupt across the country, and the Mekong Delta, too, would be thrown into chaos. The first weeks in country were a shock. For a teenager who had never left home, the Mekong Delta was overwhelming. Humid air pressing down, the smell of rice paddies and diesel fuel, the constant thrum of helicopters. Missions began before sunrise and often stretched into the night. We'd leave in the dark and come back after dark, he recalled. The days blurred together into a rhythm of patrols, landings, and sudden bursts of violence. It wasn't long before the reality of combat stripped away any illusion of adventure. He remembered the first time the door guns opened fire, the vibration of the M60 rattling his body, the tracer rounds cutting through the air. He was protecting his aircraft, yet he couldn't shake the sight of people scattering below. Sometimes you didn't know if they were farmers or Viet Cong, he admitted, but you couldn't hesitate. The Mekong Delta was deceptive in its beauty. The sun lit up endless green fields, but hidden in the tree lines and canals were trenches and bunkers dug by generations of fighters, stretching back to wars against the French and the Chinese. The Viet Cong used this landscape with skill, striking at night, moving silently in dugout canoes, vanishing into marshes at dawn. American helicopters, equipped with searchlights and firepower, hunted them from above, but it always felt like chasing shadows. For him, the first impact was the erosion of certainty. Who was the enemy? What counted as victory? The body count report said one thing, but the faces he saw told another story. Each flight carried the weight of choice. When to fire, when to hold back, when to simply survive until the rotors spun down at base. That confusion, that moral fog, became as heavy as the bullets and rockets that filled the sky. By the fall of 1967, the rhythm of war had settled into his bones. Each morning began with the roar of rotors. Each night ended with the hollow silence of exhaustion. He had become, at 19, both a mechanic and a warrior. As crew chief, he checked every bolt, every hydraulic line, making sure the Huey was ready to fly. As door gunner, he held the M60 in his hands, scanning the ground below for movement, for shapes that could mean death. We were ready for battle every day, he said. That was just how it was. Patrols carried them over rivers like the Mekong, vast brown waters that shimmered under the searchlights of the so-called Nighthawk helicopters. These ships carried powerful beams, sweeping across the darkness to expose canoes filled with armed men, or sometimes families who blurred the line between civilian and combatant. Orders were clear: engage anything hostile. But in the Delta, hostility could be hidden in silence. You didn't always know, he recalled. Sometimes they fired back. Sometimes they didn't. The enemy was deeply prepared. Since the 1950s, the Viet Minh and then the Viet Cong had built trenches, tunnels, and bunkers along the tree lines. Even the small hills that rose suddenly from the flat delta were hiding places, linked to the larger supply chain known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This vast network of paths and roads snaked through Laos and Cambodia, funneling food, weapons, and men from the north to the south. From the air, the trail was almost invisible, shielded by jungle canopy 20 feet thick. Jets and bombers hammered it with bombs and napalm, and the countryside was drenched in defoliants like Agent Orange. For the young crew chief, those chemicals were just part of the environment. We didn't know what it was doing to us, he said. The spray would come up through our rotors. We breathed it in. His missions were not just about patrol. They were about insertion and extraction, delivering infantry to contested fields, pulling them out under fire, carrying the wounded back to safety. Each landing zone was a gamble. The Huey would hover, men would run, and he and his fellow gunner would unleash bursts of fire into the tree line to cover the troops. Then, In seconds, the bird was airborne again, leaving behind chaos and sometimes bodies. The statistics made it sound clean. Hundreds of flights, thousands of soldiers moved. But inside the helicopter it was sweat, noise, and fear that clung to every man. He carried photographs home, images of boys no older than 12, pressed into service by the Viet Cong. People would look at them and say, "They look like little kids," he remembered. And I told them that's exactly who they were using. For American soldiers, facing armed children was one of the cruelest realities of the conflict. For the Vietnamese families, it was survival. Refusal meant punishment, sometimes death at the hands of their own side. And then there were the moments when the war reached out and took his closest companions. Gerald Slingerland was his best friend, another 19-year-old serving in the Cobras, the attack helicopter platoon. They drank together on nights off, sometimes missing curfew, sneaking back to base like boys in school. But in October of 1967, Gerald's helicopter suffered a catastrophic failure. The mast nut, known grimly as the Jesus nut, because if it failed, only God could save you, cracked. The rotor tore free, and the Cobra exploded into the ground. The whole crew was lost. Gerald died the day before his 19th birthday. "It was only a few months we knew each other," he said softly. "But it felt like we grew up together." The loss hardened him. Each flight after that carried not only risk but the memory of Gerald's absence. And yet, there was no pause in the war. More missions came, more patrols, more flights into the Delta. Then, as 1968 began, the calm shattered. The Tet Offensive erupted, and with it, the young soldier's world would descend into chaos unlike anything he had faced before. The Tet Offensive struck like a storm. It was January 1968, and across Vietnam, more than 80,000 Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces launched coordinated attacks on cities, bases, and outposts. In Saigon, fighting raged in the streets. In Hue, entire neighborhoods were destroyed. Even in the Mekong Delta, where he served, the scale of combat suddenly multiplied. It was probably the worst battle all Americans were engaged in for months, he recalled. For him, Tet was not a story in a newspaper. It was the loss of friends, the roar of rockets, and the fear of being overrun. One night, his unit was hit by a barrage of mortars and rockets. Men ran for cover, seeking the safety of bunkers. His gunner, Poole, sprinted to retrieve their M60 machine gun from the flight line. As he reached the helicopter, an 85mm rocket, likely a Soviet-made weapon supplied to the Viet Cong, landed beside him. The explosion killed him instantly. "He was with me for months," the veteran said, and then in one moment he was gone. The grief was immediate, searing. Poole's name would later be carved into the black granite of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, but in that instant, he was simply another 19-year-old cut down. The chaos of Tet consumed the Delta. Missions multiplied, the enemy appeared in unexpected numbers, and the pressure never lifted. Yet one memory rose above all others, seared into his mind more than 50 years later. It was a mission along the Cambodian border. Green Berets stationed at a remote outpost called for help, and his Huey was the only helicopter close enough to respond. An Air Force observation plane spotted armed men moving across the savannah with an ox cart carrying 55-gallon drums. The pilot dropped smoke to mark them. Orders came quickly. Engage. His helicopter and its crew opened fire, circling, unleashing rockets and machine gun bursts until the group below was cut down. Then came the order to land and confirm the body count. Hovering low over water and grass, the Huey descended. As he scanned the ground, he saw movement, just a flicker. Instinct took over. Without telling the others, he unplugged his intercom and jumped from the helicopter. All he had was his sidearm, a .38 pistol, clutched in his hand. He crept toward a pile of straw. On the other side lay a man wounded badly, his back torn open by machine gun fire, his leg shattered. The man turned his head, eyes locking with the young American. "He just stared at me," the veteran remembered. He shook, but he didn't say a word. Instead of pulling the trigger, he hoisted the man over his shoulder and staggered back to the helicopter. But when he turned, The Huey was gone. His crew had lifted off. Unaware, he had jumped. For nearly half an hour, he stood alone in the middle of the battlefield, carrying an enemy fighter on his back, surrounded by bodies. When the helicopter finally returned, he placed the man inside. All the way back to base, the wounded man glared at him with silent fury, eyes filled with something deeper than pain. "I never forgot that look," he said. "It's stayed with me every night since." Among the dead that day was a little girl, her body left behind for another helicopter to recover. For the veteran, that single mission fused every contradiction of the war: orders to kill, the chance to save, and the unbearable presence of the innocent caught in between. It was the moment the Vietnam War carved its deepest wound into his memory, a wound that never fully healed. The mission on the Cambodian border never left him. That night back at base, he replayed it in his mind over and over. The bodies scattered across the grass, the ox cart riddled with holes, the wounded man's silent stare, and the haunting image of the little girl left behind. "I still see his eyes," he admitted. "Even when I close mine, I see him." For many soldiers, the measure of success was the body count. Reports would be written, numbers logged, missions marked as victories. But for him, it was never numbers. It was faces. The eyes of his gunner Poole gone in an instant. The grin of Gerald Slingerland killed when his Cobra came apart in the sky. The stare of an enemy fighter, half dead, but still alive enough to condemn him without words. The war was relentless. There was no time to grieve, no pause for reflection. The next day there was another mission, and then another. Each one demanded that he climb back into the Huey, check every bolt, mount his weapon, and fly again into the Delta. Fear became routine. Loss became expected. He grew numb, yet inside the wounds deepened. He began to dream in fragments, ambushes, shadows, the sound of rockets shrieking overhead. At night, even after returning home, those dreams did not stop. He would wake screaming, convinced that punji sticks, sharpened bamboo traps once used by the Viet Cong, were stabbing through the floor beneath his bed. The nightmares took a toll on his life. Relationships unraveled. One girlfriend, terrified after he leapt from bed in the middle of a nightmare and smashed into a dresser, told him to leave. "I couldn't control it," he said. "The war followed me home." For many veterans, this was the reality. No parades, no support systems, no therapy waiting. PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, was not even recognized as a condition until 1980. For over a decade, men like him carried their pain alone. Studies later showed that nearly 30% of Vietnam veterans suffered from PTSD in some form. He was one of them. His body carried scars too. The helicopters had flown through areas soaked with defoliants, chemical sprays designed to strip the jungle of its cover. The most infamous was Agent Orange, a mixture of herbicides dropped by American planes between 1962 and 1971. More than 20 million gallons were released across Vietnam. The chemicals clung to the soil, the water, and the men who breathed them in. For him, exposure meant heart disease and a lifetime of health problems. "We didn't know it was dangerous," he explained. "Nobody told us. We flew right through it." Today, millions of veterans still live with the consequences of that hidden enemy. The immediate consequence of his service was clear: loss, trauma, and physical damage that shaped the rest of his life. But the deeper consequence was invisible. It lived in the silence between memories, in the moments when he would close his eyes and find himself back in the Delta, still 19, still watching the rivers for shadows that could kill him. Years after the war ended, he admitted that he was never truly free of it. "Vietnam followed me everywhere," he said. For a long time he tried to bury the memories, through work, through relationships, through silence. But the war lived on in restless nights, in sudden bursts of anger, in dreams that dragged him back to the Mekong Delta. He would wake drenched in sweat, his heart racing, convinced he was still under fire. For him, the greatest burden was not only the friends he lost, but the choices he was forced to make at 19. The face of the wounded man on the Cambodian border became a mirror he could not escape. Was he enemy or victim? Was saving him an act of mercy or futility? The question never found an answer. He stared at me like I was the most evil person in the world, he confessed. I'll never forget it. He carried that weight into civilian life. Returning home, he found little understanding. Unlike veterans of earlier wars, many who came back from Vietnam were met not with parades but with silence, or worse, hostility. The country was divided, protests filled the streets, and soldiers were sometimes called names instead of heroes. For him, this deepened the sense of isolation. He was proud of his service, yet ashamed of what he had seen. It was a contradiction that gnawed at him. It took decades before healing began. Working later as a nurse, he confronted death again when a young woman choked in front of him and could not be saved. That tragedy unlocked memories he had tried to seal away. For the first time, he sought help at the VA. Therapy opened doors he had long kept closed, and he began to speak the words he once held back. Slowly, he connected with other veterans who shared the same invisible wounds. He found solace in community. Veterans organizations, support groups, and simple conversations with men who had seen the same skies, the same rivers, the same losses. He became part of the Combat Veterans Association, a circle where stories could be told without judgment. He was honored with a quilt of valor, a handmade gift symbolizing gratitude and healing. He went on an honor flight, traveling to Washington, D.C. to stand before the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, tracing the name of his best friend Gerald on the black granite wall. I felt like I was bringing him home, he said softly. The reflection in the polished stone was not just his own. It was the reflection of a 19-year-old boy who never made it back, and of the countless others whose stories ended too soon. In those moments, surrounded by memory and recognition, he felt a measure of peace that had eluded him for decades. The story of one helicopter crew chief is also the story of an entire generation. Vietnam was unlike the wars that came before it. It was fought on television screens, broadcast nightly into American living rooms. Images of burning villages, wounded soldiers, and body bags arriving home forced the public to confront the cost of the conflict in real time. For the first time, a war was being judged not just on the battlefield but also in the streets of the United States. By 1968, more than 500 American soldiers were dying every week. The Tet Offensive shocked the American public, showing that even after years of fighting, the enemy was capable of massive coordinated attacks. Trust in political leaders eroded, protest movements grew, fueled by college students, civil rights activists, and families who questioned why their sons were being sent halfway around the world. Returning veterans, many only teenagers when they left, came home to a country deeply divided. Some were greeted with gratitude, but many more faced indifference or hostility. We didn't talk about it back then, he explained. It was easier to stay quiet. The cost of the war went far beyond politics. Agent Orange exposure left generations of veterans battling illnesses. PTSD, still unnamed at the time, hollowed out families and lives. Relationships crumbled under the weight of nightmares and anger that no one could explain. For men like him, the war never truly ended. It lived in their bodies, in their memories, and in the silence they carried for decades. Yet in time, recognition began to grow. Organizations like the Veterans of Foreign Wars and the Vietnam Veterans of America provided spaces for healing. The Honor Flight program, which has flown more than 250,000 veterans to Washington, D.C., gave many their first chance to stand before the memorial wall and feel their service acknowledged. The Quilt of Valor project has wrapped over 300,000 veterans in handmade quilts, a gesture of comfort and respect. These acts, small compared to the years of neglect, have become symbols of a society trying to make amends. The story of the veteran in the Mekong Delta is a reminder that wars are not only measured in battles won or lost. They are measured in the lives altered forever, friends buried far from home, families broken by grief, and survivors who carry invisible scars into old age. His memories are not just his own. They echo through thousands of voices from that era, each one a thread in the fabric of history. For the veteran, telling his story was not about strategy or politics. It was about giving voice to those who never came back, and making sure that the lessons of Vietnam, the the confusion, the cost, the resilience, are not forgotten. "I'll never forget the faces," he said. "My best friend, my gunner, even the man I carried on my shoulder that day, they all stayed with me." His words cut through the decades, a reminder that the Vietnam War was not just fought in jungles and rice paddies, but in the memories of those who lived it. Today, his voice joins the chorus of veterans who speak not to glorify war, but to honor sacrifice and survival. Their testimonies bridge the gap between history and humanity, ensuring that future generations understand both the cost and the courage that defined an era. This is why we preserve these stories, not as numbers in reports, not as distant headlines, but as lived experience. Through them, the silence of forgotten battles breaks, and the humanity of those who served endures. "Life is good now," he reflected, "but I still see them every night." This is Vietnam War Archives. If this story moved you, share it, discuss it, and remember with us, so that the voices of those who served will never be lost.